Welcome back, everybody. Here we are to wrap up Chapter 5 with Section 3, Limits to Population Growth. Largely, we're going to look at what a population is, what are the factors that limit a particular population in a specific habitat, etc. So, here we go. First off, population. Now, classic textbook definition of this is a group of interbreeding individuals of the same species. Perfectly fine, lovely, wonderful definition. The only problem with definitions are you got to be able to remember them. And typically these textbook definitions never really work for me. My brain isn't that wordy, or yeah, I know, I talk all the time. But I filter things in really simple, short breakdowns. So for me, my definition is same species, same place, same time. That way I can work out in any kind of scenario, is this actually a population or not? You know, if they give me a particular picture. Is it the same species? Well, they talk about interbreeding. Well, you have to be the same species if you can have sex and produce offspring, right? So, same species. By interbreeding, we're really talking about being at the same place at the same time. So it's all in there, but for me, I just like that. Same species, same place, same time. So mice at Buchholz. Yes, there are mice at Buchholz. There are mice at Eastside. There are mice everywhere. There are probably mice near your house. Heaven forbid there be one in your house. But mice at Buchholz. Well, who are the mice at Buchholz having sex with? Yeah, mice at Buchholz. The mice at Buchholz aren't trekking across town to Eastside to have sex with Eastside mouse and then heading back over to... Yeah. So there is a population of mice at Buchholz, and I can talk about a population of mice at GHS. It's same species, same time, but not the same place. Or I could talk about the population of Buchholz mice when Buchholz first opened in the 1970s, or I could talk about the Buchholz mice currently there. The mice alive today couldn't have sex with the mice alive when Buchholz opened. Not at the same time. They can't interbreed. So I can only talk about a population with people being alive around the same time frame. So populations also, we talked about what the population was in 1970, what the population was in 2000, what the population was in 2020, but same species, same place, same time. At least they have to be in the same age range in order to interbreed. All right, so that's what a population is. Now, variables that govern changes in population size. This one is very simple. How many people are in Gainesville now? Well, if you have a number to begin with, we knew there were 100,000 at the beginning of the year. Well, now all we have to do is look at the number of births and the number of deaths, right? If we had, I'm going to throw wild numbers out there, if we had 2,000 births in Gainesville this year and 1,000 deaths, well, the population went up by 1,000. If we had 2,000 deaths and 1,000 births, the population went down by 1,000. Pretty simple math. But we do also have to look at immigration and emigration. Immigration are the people that moved into Gainesville. Came to Gainesville, didn't used to live here, but now they moved in. And emigration, the people that graduated college or got their thing and now they've moved off. So for any population, we could take a population of deer. We're going to look at births and deaths, is what's happening to the population, is it growing or declining? But we also have to look at immigration and emigration. Did other deer move in and join this particular group, flock, not a flock, herd of deer? So did other deer come and join this herd? And did some other deer break off and leave? So birth, death, and then immigration, moving in, or emigration, moving out. Basic, simple variables when we're looking at a population. Now we also want to look at the age structure, because this is going to determine what's going to happen to a particular population. If most of the population is a pre-reproductive stage, well, it's not going to have an uptick right away. They can't reproduce yet. They're too young. If most of the population is in the reproductive stage, then we can expect a pretty sharp upturn. Lots of them going to start having babies, and the population is going to grow. If most of the population is post-reproductive stage, then we're going to expect it to slow down, not be as much. I heard on the radio yesterday that over 50% of the people in America are under the age of 40, putting most of our population at the reproductive stage. So we can expect continued growth. Just an idea. Variables that govern it: births, deaths, immigration, emigration, and then at what stage is the population as their age structure? Are most of them before being able to reproduce? Let's say if we're talking about a human population, are they below the age of 13? Are they reproductive stage? Say between 18 and 40, give take. Or are they post-reproductive stage? Most people beyond the age of 40. These are some of the factors we have to look at to determine it. Now, within those very broad setups of just the environment, if you will, that could be conducive to a population change, we're going to look at some of these limiting factors, and we're going to look at a range of potential tolerance. So everything has a particular range with which it can exist in. Physical and chemical environment that they're in. Once again, we can withstand a certain amount of pollution, and we're getting too much carbon monoxide, and we get sick and we die. So we all have certain tolerance. If you're a fish, the water has to be a reasonable level of clarity or purity. At a certain point, you're okay, and too many pollutants in it, chemicals, and you can die. So that's what we mean by both the physical, how hot it is, how cold it is, how much, just the physical environment, and the potential chemical environment, whatever's coming into it, whether it's natural or not, forest fire and a lot of smoke. But let's look at the basic limiting factors. If we're talking about terrestrial, on land, the big two are temperature and precipitation, with precipitation sort of being king. The more rain, the more organisms you can have, and the larger the organisms can be. In a forest, we get a lot of rain, so you get big trees. A grassland, you don't get as much rain, and you get grass, and you get a few trees, but not many. A desert, very few trees at all. You might have some saguaro cactuses, but very few large organisms. So precipitation is key, but temperature is also a big one. And this is how we can determine biomes. If you tell me what the average temperature and what the average rainfall or precipitation for an area is, I can pretty much tell you what biome you're in. Once again, temperature and precipitation is your main dictators on land. If we're talking about water, the book talks about water temperature, depth, clarity, and other factors. Well, when I talk about water, there's four. The big factors in water are sunlight, temperature, oxygen, and nutrients. Sunlight, temperature, oxygen, nutrients. These are key for an aquatic thing. How much sunlight can get there? Because sunlight is going to dictate the bottom end of the food chain. The algae growing, which the plankton are going to eat on the algae, and then some phytoplankton, then the small things eat on that, bigger things eat on it, etc. So sunlight is important. Temperature, how warm it is. Typically, the more sunlight, the more oxygen, and the warmer it is, we have more organisms because we wind up having more nutrients. The deeper down in the ocean you get, you're getting less sunlight, also you're getting less oxygen. Oxygen sits on the surface and then it dissolves into the water. So the shallow areas are higher oxygen rich than the deeper areas. So in the oceans and any aquatic, we tend to find more living things near the surface where sunlight can penetrate. Anyway, on land, we're basically looking at precipitation and temperature. In the water, the big four: sunlight, temperature, oxygen, and nutrients. Now, when we talk about a population density, things can be density dependent or things can be density independent, affecting what they are or where they go. I'm going to throw this picture up here. We're going to look at a basic curve, classic bell curve of something limiting factors. For instance, in this case, we're looking at trout, and they have a pretty narrow temperature range that they can live in. If the temperature gets too cold, I have no fish. They can't survive in it. And then I get an area where it's in this zone of physiological stress. It's stressful, but they can be there. That's like you and me without a coat on and it's 40 degrees outside. I can survive it. I can be there for a while, but I'm uncomfortable. And long term, if I don't have a coat or shelter or something, I can't survive in 40-degree weather long term with nothing. So then we get into this optimal range, and that's where we find the most fish. Down here I have no fish, I have few, I find most of them here. And then the other way, it starts to get too warm. Same thing. Some organisms can't exist there, we'll deal with it, we'll tolerate it, but eventually we find none. They either die or they have to leave that area. So things that populate, it's just one of temperature. We could look at any of them, especially with trout. Oxygenation is big. They have to have very highly oxygenated water, as opposed to like a catfish. Catfish can live with very little oxygen in a water. Okay. When we're looking at these populations, no population can grow indefinitely. It can't just continue to grow and grow and grow and get more and more and more number. Kind of like human beings have been doing over the past couple of centuries. We've just seen this sharp intake as the population on the planet gets higher and higher and higher. It can't do that forever. Eventually, we reach a carrying capacity. Water, food, space. At least for humans or land animals, those things are big limiting factors. Some species can reproduce exponentially. Now, there are certain factors involved here. If something can reproduce at an early age, we talked about bacteria before, but insects tend to fall into this as well. They can begin reproducing very quickly, usually within days after being born or becoming into their adults. Some of them have multiple stages, but they reproduce at an early age. They tend to have a lot of offspring each time that they do reproduce. Short intervals between their reproductive cycles. They can lay a lot of eggs, turn around and lay a lot of eggs again, or give live birth, whatever the case may be. These type of individuals produce a J-shaped curve of growth. Classic exponential curve of a population. Once again, bacteria, many insects tend to, when they're introduced into an environment that has enough space, enough food, we tend to see these J-shaped curves, this exponential growth of curves. Now, population growth in nature is always limited. We refer to this as environmental resistance. For example, I've talked about some bacteria can reproduce within 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, I introduce one bacteria into the petri dish that has enough food and the right temperature environment for the bacteria. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, etc. Now, if this growth was allowed to go unchecked, nothing stopped it, nothing killed it. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8. Nothing stops this process. Within 36 hours, that bacteria would be a foot deep over the planet Earth. 36 hours from 1 to covering the entire Earth a foot deep. Why doesn't it happen? Because these bacteria are out there? Well, environmental resistance. all the factors that limit the population growth. The bacteria has to have food, it has to have a particular temperature range, has to have a certain amount of moisture. So in the Petri dish, all the conditions are just right, and we can watch this uncontrolled growth. But it only happens in the Petri dish. When it gets out in the real world on my desk, there's not a lot of food on my desk. There's not a lot of place for this thing to grow uncontrollably. So it kind of grows up quickly, and then it reaches its carrying capacity, and it stays within that level. Carrying capacity is the maximum population of a given species, whether it's deer, humans, mice, dogs, bacteria, that a particular habitat can sustain indefinitely. So I talk about a population of deer in a set of woods. Well, how much food is in that woods? How much water is accessible for the deer? And all those factors will dictate how many deer can probably live there indefinitely. Population may go up, the population may go down, but it can support 100 deer, so to speak. And if we have fewer deer than that, then they'll probably grow. We get more deer than that, and they'll probably die back. Anytime we get an overshoot, we get this dieback. Let's say 100 deer can live in that area. Now, you know what? Let's take a look at this graph and talk about deer. Specifically, this was a reindeer population, and it was introduced into a little island, Bering Strait, off of St. Paul. Well, they brought them in, they brought in a 20, 30 reindeer into this small island, had everything the reindeer needed. It had some food, had space, they could get water, there weren't other reindeer, they didn't have any other predators there. That'd be a great place for reindeer to go and populate. Well, as you can see, they very quickly, that yellow line at the bottom, that's their carrying capacity. They expected, it looks like around 100, they expected this herd to get to be around 100 and sort of level off, because that's about how much food and space was there. But they reproduced, a little bit of a diet, and then they went from 1930 to 1940 on a reproductive tear. So what happens originally is you get a population in that's fairly normal. Some are too young to reproduce, some are too old. They may have just brought in mature animals. Only a few of them were able to reproduce. Well, within 15 to 20 years, what we get are most of the population are now reproductive age. And these reproductive age deer got busy, making baby deer. And the population climbs like crazy. Well, now they're eating all the food, they're drinking all the, there's not space, there's not shelter, they've stripped all the bark off of all that food, and we see a crash. And this is very typical. Most of them just starved to death. Few remain, and then the population begins to creep back up. But if a population growth grows continually, beyond its carrying capacity, that's the key. It's got to go beyond the carrying capacity. Eventually, it'll crash. Let's look at a couple of different types of species. We're going to talk about R-selected species. Now, R-selected species fit a certain set of criteria. They tend to have capacity for a high rate of reproduction. Think sea turtles laying 400 eggs. Not humans giving birth to 1 or maybe 2 children at a time. So a high capacity for a population growth. So some examples of this are going to be algae, bacteria, frogs, laying lots of eggs. Most insects tend to fall on this, and a lot of fish as well. Think Nemo. We're going to call them all marlin. Okay, we'll name this one. Yeah, they lay a lot of eggs at a time. This is our selected species. A capacity for a high rate of reproduction. And they tend to go through irregular and unstable cycle changes in their population sizes. There's a whole bunch of them, and then they were very few. Whole bunch, very few. They tend to be opportunists. They take advantage of the opportunities when the opportunities exist. So if the environment's favorable, we have a whole bunch of these things. There's cicadas everywhere. I haven't seen a cicada in years. Opportunists. But this is the R-selected species, as opposed to K-selected. So we're looking at opposite extremes here. K-selected, these are species that tend to reproduce later in life. Large mammals fit this perfectly. Elephants, humans. You've got to be at least 13 as a human being before your body can even go through the process of reproduction. And 18 tends to be much better. Most women have fully developed by the time they're 18, so it's not as potentially harmful. I'm not saying what's best or right, or just biologically. So, K-selected species, they tend to reproduce later in life, not after 20 minutes or 2 days. They tend to have few offspring. Elephant tends to have only a few offspring, and it takes a couple of years from the time that they are conceived until birth. Same with humans. We tend to have one offspring at a time. Sure, there's occasions of twins or triplets, but these are very rare. Most people, one at a time. We tend to have long lifespans as opposed to bacteria, which may only live a few days, or some insects that at best live a year or something. Tend to have long lifespans. So large mammals, whales, humans, some birds of prey, eagles, and some long-lived plants like oak tree may fit into this K-selected species, but they're also vulnerable to extinction for some of these same reasons. A long time before they can have children, tend to have few children. Now, one of the big differences is when they tend to die. So we'll look at that one here in just a second. A case study. The exploding white-tailed deer population in the United States. In the early 1900s, there was a lot of deer habitat destruction, whether it was just logging, setting up suburbs, homes, towns, factories, etc., and uncontrolled hunting. At that point in time, if you wanted to go hunt and you wanted to go bag deer, shoot deer to eat for fun, whatever, there was no regulation on it. You could go shoot 50 deer in a weekend if that's what you wanted to do. Nothing regulated it. In the 1920s and the 1930s, we started setting up some laws to protect deer because the deer populations, we think we're down to about 500,000 deer total, at least in the eastern U.S. at the time we were looking at the data. So we put in some laws to protect it. So now you had to get a license and you could only get so many deer a year, etc. And the deer recovered, and they have done remarkably well. Well over 30 million deer in the U.S. now. So from the 20s to now, in 100 years, the deer populations recovered from 500,000 to 30 million, doing really well. Well, because of this deer population, and really a lot of it's in the suburbs, deer tend to be these animal species that like the edge of the ecosystem. They kind of live in the forest, but they like to live at the edge of the forest. They can go into the forest for protection and come out of the forest to eat. So suburbs are perfect for the deer population. They come out of the woods nearby, and a lot of times we fragmented these sections of woods so they don't have as much space in the woods. So they come out into the suburbs and they eat the flowers, the plants, the shrubs in our suburbs. And it's not unusual to see 4 or 5 deer cruising through a suburb sometime, and they're grazing in the lawns. It's also brought on a lot of deer crashes, if you will, cars impacting deer. The largest death by animal in America is deer. It's not because deer are attacking, but cars hitting deer. Over 130, around 150 people a year die from cars impacting deer. No other animal outside of the mosquito or something in the United States has that many deaths associated with it. People are afraid of getting attacked by a shark. You should be afraid of the deer running in front of your car. We're looking at some different methods to try and control this deer population, because not really by killing them off now, but how do we keep them out of the suburbs, out of some of these areas, and it poses a difficulty, if you will. From there, take a look at these survivorship curves that we talked about. We talked about the R species and the K species. So what we tend to get are certain things. In the K-selected species, most members tend to die off later in life. Once again, we tend to have birth to one child. We spend a lot of time with it, care, maintenance. Most of our offspring tend to live late in life. Same with a whale or an elephant. They give birth to only a few offspring, and they tend to nurture and care for them, even in herds or pods or packs, until they have their really shot at adulthood. So with the K-selected species, we tend to have late losses. They tend to die when they're older. The R-selected species, we tend to have early loss. Taking a look at the picture we have up here, see what we mean. With the elephant, they live a long time and then they die off when they're older. But then, like it shows flowers, this could be bacteria, could be many insects, sea turtles, for instance. Well, the sea turtles are born, right? But most of those sea turtles die early. Most of them die within their first day. They don't even make it to the beach. The seagulls are eating them as soon as they get in. Octopus eat them, sharks come up. It's a feeding frenzy when they're born. So there's a lot of early loss in there. Any of these things that tend to produce a lot of offspring really young, and then they don't even care for them. You know, the sea turtle lays its egg, takes off, doesn't even know when they hatch, has no protection at all. So there's a lot of early loss. But then our friend the squirrel here is a constant loss. So K species, we tend to have a survivorship curve, type 3, where there's late loss. The bacteria, insects, sea turtles tend to have these R species, tend to have a early loss, infant mortality, if you will. Lots of the infant's baby die. Fish eggs, once again, any of these that give lots of birth, but few make it to adulthood. And then you have things like the squirrel. They're just a constant loss. Some of them get knocked out of the nest and die as an infant. Some of them die in their first year. Some of them live, I know a rat's lifespan is 3 years. I'm going to guess a squirrel is somewhere in that same neighborhood, 3 to 5 years. But they just tend to die in a constant rate from birth all the way up to old age of a squirrel. So we get all these 3 different types of survivorship curves. Here's a question for you. A mature white oak tree. Just think oak tree. We could make it a live oak for us here in Florida. Doesn't really matter. It produces thousands of acorns a year, right? This produces a food source for a lot of animals. An average lifespan of one of these trees is like 300 years. So, which term is going to apply best to this species? Is it a type 1 survivor? Type 2, type 3? I think the slide we just saw. Would it be a K-selected species or an R-selected species? Would it be better defined as a pioneer species or a climax species? Which terms would we refer to it? So what type of survivorship? Is it K or R? And would you say it's a pioneer species or a climax species? Something to think about. Human beings, you and me, we're not exempt from these population controls. If we look at the population curve, it's different for different countries, but overall the human population is undergoing right now an exponential. We're in a J curve. We can't do that forever. And we could look at certain populations where this has definitely happened to. Ireland in the 1840s to early 1850s, their potato crops were destroyed by fungus, and that was their main source of food at the time. Over 1 million people in Ireland died of starvation, and another 1 million more emigrated, left Ireland. So it decimated the population of Ireland in the middle of the 1800s. Bubonic plague. The bubonic plague came through Europe, killed 25 million people. A third of Europe gone. This would be like, if you're at school and looking around, 1/3 of the school gone from bubonic plague. Absolutely devastated. Bubonic plague was carried by rats. The fleas would get on the rats, get on humans, bite the humans, and transferred to them. Antibiotics keep it from happening now. But humans have seen some of these natural population controls in the past. We're not immune to it. However, our technological ability, whether it's the advent of antibiotics, medicines, etc., our ability to produce GMOs so that we can better produce more food for more people, social and cultural changes have really expanded our carrying capacity for the human species. We're not exactly sure what the carrying capacity of the planet is, but our technological ability has definitely increased it. But at some point, our expansive growth is going to have to level off, and we'll find out what the carrying capacity of the planet is. But at some point, we will run out of space, because once again, for us to grow food takes space. So it's not just enough space for us all to live. We also have to have things for these environmental services. We got to have water, we got to be able to have food, and we have to have plants to produce the oxygen we need to survive. So it comes into all of it. Last bit here is just sort of tying this chapter together. We talked about the sea otter, how it acted as a keystone species. Remember this aspect of a keystone species? It's one species that does a lot of things for the entire environment. How the sea otter keeps the kelp forest alive, it keeps the sea urchins in check, so the kelp forest exists, so many other organisms and even humans benefit from the kelp forest. The sea otters are kind of like the protectors of the kelp forest. Populations of most plants and animals depend on solar energy. Once again, temperature and precipitation if it's a land environment. Sunlight, how much sunlight can get in, affects the nutrients of a water, and then along with temperature and oxygen levels. But populations depend on the solar energy and nutrient cycling to exist. And the biodiversity within our planet provides these paths for the energy flow and our nutrient cycling to go on, so we can all go on. Oh, that is it for chapter 5. Take care, guys. We'll see you next time.